Joanna. I think Jevon's coming. Misha, Jessica, Mona, and Allison.
Thank you. Thanks.
Here he is. The man is with us.
Oh, thank you. Noticing.
We noticed we both tried to get papers back to you when you weren't there. You gonna sit down?
You want me to? So let me at least formulate some of the things I was trying to do. But first I just want to say, first of all, what a great joy it is to teach this with art, but also to discover that without intending these interesting convergences of our thinking, even though it's from very different angles. I think Jevon pointed out also when we were on the phone, but I saw it again last night, this kind of emphasis on the heart, the purity of the heart, the focus of the heart as a balance point. Both of us quite independently formulated these issues, and so it's just a brother in the spirit. So it's
You know, I wrote something about a month ago about the Sheish Zechirot. I had no idea.
Really?
I opened yours. He did that much better than I did.
So let me tell you why I did that. So let me tell you where this stands in the theological project that I'm trying to still work through. I wanted to find space in the theological writing for how one can make use of the language of the tradition and personalize it for a path of spiritual growth and development of consciousness. I think if there's a plus or a minus in what I've been focusing on, it's largely focused on trying to cultivate a certain kind of consciousness with the actions that may flow out of it, or the actions that what one can perceive. But from my major concern is really clarifying awareness, all the techniques that help clarify awareness, and then everything that flows from that, what one can see, what one can do, the way one can focus, and so on. So I wanted to find a way within the space of the tradition to personalize and more concretely formalize a kind of ladder of movement of particular growth. Now, of course, you're all aware of the Rambam's introduction to the Shmona Prakim, where in many ways he's trying to integrate both Averroes and Aristotle and his own approach to a kind of more philosophical growth of intellectual consciousness. That's not my project, or the particular way that he's trying to create a certain kind of philosophical clarity of mind. As I indicated, I'm trying to develop a theological way of orienting myself towards things. And I somehow discovered, I think I came across the idea before I saw it in Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, but it was sort of through my own morning davening. At the end, of course, of the prayer book, you have the Sheish Zechirot. I've included 7 because it helps me work the Shabbat as the climax, as a kind of sequence. But I came as a personal practice to begin to recite this as a way of kind of mindfulness and trying to ask myself, what does it mean to hold historical memories in mind and to make them personal and to make them productive for one's religious life? In thinking through that whole movement, it became clear to me that each separately, but the sequence as a scale, works in a certain way of kind of the struggle of what happens when you move from Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is a kind of opening of the mind, an opening of consciousness, breaking through the Meitzarim, as everybody understands, and moving towards the openness of freedom, the danger of freedom, the fear of freedom, what one does with one's spiritual freedom, and then, of course, following that up to the various moments. So for me, in that case, Amalek is also the nechashalim, those, the things you've left behind, the things that drag you back, the kind of things that are unfinished business that sort of attack you from behind, all of which don't allow you to keep moving forward in the midbar, which is a kind of an empty, open space, because you don't have any kind of point of orientation yet. There's a kind of opening of consciousness, but Sinai has not given us a kind of a particular orientation, both in time or in space. So there are a lot of things of unfinished business of having kotze ruach and avodah kasha inside one that need to kind of still be worked through.
I stopped at that one. Your Amalek one bothered me a little bit because it said, "Are you blaming the victims? Is there a force of Amalek out there that comes and bites us, and to say it's all about our being nechshalim and ayefi yageya and lo yirei Elohim? I wasn't sure if the victims were being.
I think I said at one point that there's a great reality to evil and there's a great reality to harm. I sort of tried to come at that point when I mentioned that is to stress the fact that unless you come to terms with Amalek, memory and resentment can destroy you. And you have to begin to see what negative memories are on their own terms. Because we're dealing with second generation perpetrators, things like that. So it's very important for me at least to try to understand what the limits of recognizing real evil and not to be projecting my own unfinished business onto that, but to try to get some clarity that the Zecher of Amalek is not just blaming the victim, but also being aware that anger and resentment comes also from us, and to try to understand how much can you recognize what really took place, but to see it clearly. So that forgiveness could take place, so recognition could take place, so that you can move on. And it doesn't mean that you forget. That's why I played at the very end on to remember this, al tishkach, but don't forget to forget. Don't remember to forget. But that's at the far end. At a certain point, when there can be healing, there can be a possibility by playing paradoxically with the language, you should remember to forget. There's a point where you have to let go of certain kinds of features that can be destructive. So I was trying to play both with that, but I think it's important that you emphasize that. I think the emphasis was on that lingering quality that is resentment, or that the failure to complete a task. But there is, of course, real evil, and there is really an Amalek, but there's also the task when you've been liberated through Mitzrayim to see it for what it is, and for what its limits are, and how it really affects you and other people. And I think that's part of the spiritual work that I would want to deal with. So the Yetziat Mitzrayim is the positive, the Amalek is a negative that has to be integrated. We move to Sinai, and the whole issue of Shemo et nafshecha, you have to kind of guard yourself. There's a kind of a whole new form of self-care that has to take place to see what's happening on the day, the way the particular things reorient you. So Sinai, in that sense, in this particular way of identifying with this on a personal level, is to see how through the tradition everything that happens reorients you as a kind of a mini Mamad Har Sinai. And there's a kind of a giving and the receiving. And then to that too, there's this negative. The negative then becomes the avodah zarah. Is the fear of standing in that kind of nakedness. So you fix on things. You close up. You have static images. You can't simply await for the next new moment that tells you how you reorient yourself. In that sense, I must say I'm deeply influenced by Rosenzweig, who is actually in this case influenced by Rosenthal Kusi, where one of the ways that he understands what revelation does is it reorients you. It's a point of orientation. When something happens of significance, it gives you a back and a forward and a side, and you'll be able to see how you move forward. It gives you a kind of axial point. There's a lot else that happens about revelation, but it's also for him an axial point in time and space that you reorganize yourself by something else happening. In my own mind, in my own prayer life, I often play that off against the whole Gemara that, like, if you find yourself in the desert, right, and you don't know which way to go, you have to orient yourself in terms of your own notion of time for Shabbat, or open for space, of how you would create an Eruv and so on and so forth. But a revelatory moment is not in the empty space of the midbar. It's when something is happening that gives you a kind of axial point. But that also can become a place of fixation, and a form of the Avodah Zarah can be that fixing and that closing. The next positive and negative that happen after that is, the positive is of course the man. So it really follows after the Avodah Zarah, because in that sense it's the ability to be surprised, to ask the question, what is this? It's that renewal of consciousness out of the fear of the Avodah Zarah, right? It's that renewal of wondering what is going on here, and being able to then to receive what's happening. And I use the various verses that are related to that. And that's very much the opening question, that everything, one of the axial points of orientation is when the question opens something up, and being able to be ready for that. I also in my own davening life, the issue with Miriam came to be a very important paragraph as well. And it's not the whole aspect, but it's the aspect of al-odot. It says, if the presumption, when you make presumptions, the using of that phrase al-odot, you presume something, either because you're jealous, or you're competitive, or you find lashon hara, or whatever it would be in that issue. But the al-odot is, even against your better will for being man, of asking the question, there is a kind of, there are presumptions that we have that we leap to certain kind of conclusions. So that is that negative side that plays off against the man in the desert. And then of course the Shabbat becomes this larger notion of personal and more cosmic letting go. So within the space of this, of the theology, I felt it was important for me to try to articulate, how do you personalize historical moments? How do you turn that into a kind of scale and ladder of spiritual consciousness? Of course it's not a fixed and final one, but it at least gives a kind of contemplative structure to be able to see through certain kinds of sequences on the way, coming from Drash, and on the way to Sod. So it's another way of coming in touch with subjectivity. Remember when we talked about the Pshat, it was personhood, but that personhood that's open to numerous influences, open to numerous things as people in the world, not necessarily bound by certain traditional forms. Then you go into that communal we voice of Drash. And this is a return to the personal voice, but through the mediation of tradition. So it's another way of struggling with, how do you formulate your own derech? I used a phrase that became very important to me. There's a Musar book that I quoted. If you look in the notes, it's Matzpun L'Chachma. It was done by a Musarnik from North Africa, Ivgi, And he used this interesting phrase in connection with Parashat Yitro that I once came across, and he talks about that the personal path is derech la derech. And in a certain sense, that's one of the ways that I'm trying to deal with the remes. It's the derech la derech, but everybody has to find their own specific sequence or their own specific nuanced language within that larger framework to find the derech la derech, or it's the derech for your own avoda. I use that language of a personal avodas Hashem. Everybody has to find their way to turn everything that we engage as part of their avoda. So that's the larger framework in which I try to place this part of the remez that balances me between the community of drash and what we'll see as a kind of more mystical or cosmic consciousness when we get to Sod. And let me just say parenthetically that I'm going to give Lorena the material for next week so that you'll have it right away. So I'm glad to hear Art's response or anybody who has questions about what I said. This is kind of a tansit, a little bit of a minuscule statement of what I wanted to do, but I think...
Just a clarifying question. I liked the few words you just used, community of drash. Can you just repeat what you said about Sod?
Well, the Sod, with Sod, of course, as you'll see when you read it, it puts selfhood in a much more precarious position in terms of the larger cosmos, and it also retains a notion of selfhood because you're trying to situate a consciousness within a much more cosmic setting. So there's a certain kind of attention, and you'll see when you get to the Sod, I actually tried to do, as you'll see, a kind of variation on Luriana Kabbalah. So I felt you can't just go directly to Sod. So what I try to do is, what is the pshat of Sod? What is the drash of Sod? What is the remez of Sod? And then the Sod of Sod. Because you have to find the Sod within all these other kinds of things. Because we don't necessarily, I don't believe in some kind of cosmic realm where Sod exists in some kind of a ontological way. So then how do you we'll see about that next week, but that's why I did it this way. But that's why it's balanced between the communal self, and then the self that's open to a universal order of humankind or any kind of existence that we then want to kind of not necessarily dissolve into, but be absorbed into this so that consciousness is more permeable, and also at the same time to be aware of that, otherwise it has no moral or spiritual payout. So so this is part of another level of that cultivation of who I want to be in terms of, I think it's very important to think when I began with the Rambam, or when you look at all the thinkers throughout both Jewish, Christian, and Islamic who talk about spiritual growth as a therapy of the soul, they all have to say, you can't heal yourself until you first have to know what your problem is, what your spiritual illness is, and then what the therapeutic is. Like, what are you trying to get to? What would be the healing? So part of that is what I was trying to meditate on in this remez, trying to figure out what are the stuck and the difficult points, and what is the therapy of the soul that one has to try to get to. I mean, that's a classic issue, but of course we have to do it in our own way, in our own language, without reducing it to psychology, et cetera, but to keep it on a theological plane. Does that help?
Just a little bit in response. Yes, we are in some ways very much on the same wavelength. I spent the last 4 years, my big project for the last 4 years has been the translation of the Me'or Einayim, which I've been working on. And in the Me'or Einayim, one of the Hasidic classics, the key term is da'at. And I usually translate da'at there as awareness. I might have said mindfulness if it weren't really taken by the American Buddhists, and I felt a little copycatish using mindfulness. But awareness is what it's about. Sometimes it's mind, sometimes it's awareness. It's never da'at, it's never knowledge. But it's always intimate awareness, because you always have a da'at in the background of what da'at means. And so there's a kind of awareness and intimacy. So I think, in some sense, that the religious life is about cultivating awareness is sort of a ground that we have in common. I didn't get quite how remez becomes as personal as it is for you, or as about the individual and the cultivation of mind as it is for you, because remez is a level of text reading. You, in some ways, are sort of doing what St. Francis says: let's put aside the book of Scripture and go to the book of life. And so it's then the remez that we find throughout our lives. It's the remez we find in Bechol V'Chechad V'Ehu, rather than the remez we find in the text. Since we don't believe that there's a code in the text, as you say very clearly in the interlude, so we don't have the text to give us remez. We have life to give us remez. And that went a little too fast for me, I think. Because you don't mean to be outside the text that wholly. I know you well enough to know that the text means more to you than that, and I felt you sort of dismissed the text. The text can't do that for us. So let's talk about how all of life does that for us. And that, as I say, that was a little too absolute for me, or too dismissive. No, I wasn't going there at all.
Okay.
I was leaving the Chirot word aside.
Okay.
But I felt I didn't see you deal with the question, is there a remez level in the text, or in the tradition that we have to talk to, which is to say, how before we get to finding sodot to the text, how we personalize the text, how we bring the text home to us, and talk about, well, when you do something like Mitzrayim in the Hasidic way you do, sort of Mitzrayim is everything that's a Meitzar for us and how we are liberated from it. A lot of the kinds of things that I do with the liturgy in my commentary and the prayer, but sort of taking that text and personifying, and I felt that was how I understand remez. Before you get to Sfirot or Sod language, you get to how do I read this text in terms of my own journey. So I have a piece where I write on the new Kabbalah that's going to be written for our day. Parshat Masa'eh will be central to it, because we are all such wanderers, and we could easily pattern out our lives as Vayisumi, Vayachanube, Vayisumi, Berkeley, Vayachanube, Philadelphia, Vayisumi, Boston, Vayachanube, Seattle, and so we could sort of do that. We could sort of do that because we are such wanderers. I felt that kind of personifying of the text was what I wanted to see more. And I felt you said, well, we don't have a code in the text, and so we're just going to do it. We're just going to do it with life itself. Which, as I say, that was a little too fast. That was a little too quick for me somehow. But I wanted to take a look at page 3 of your interlude, if I can call your attention to, because I think this is a wonderful paragraph. It really says so much of what we both have wanted to say. So if you can find it, mindful doing,
right.
A commentary. We meet the God-bestowed world. The God-bestowed world is also a beautiful phrase, with mind and body saturated by its omnipresence and embedded within it. The spiritual challenge is to cultivate a God-centered mindfulness that receives the fullness of our earthly reality as expressions of divinity. I mean, you could spend a lifetime digesting that sentence. Receives the fullness of our earthly reality as expressions of divinity. The cascade of life reveals these expressions daily in numerous ways. They may be received through the medium of the obligations and duties of Jewish tradition, and also through a disposition that receives the impress of existence through a spiritual orientation and consciousness. I guess I wondered if you have the disposition that receives the impress of existence through a spiritual orientation and consciousness. Do you really need the obligations and duties of Jewish tradition? It feels like you've got such a natural theology here. In some ways, the Jewish tradition is almost imposed on it. God's express presence is received by seekers as an extension of the creation. I'm completely there with you. Manifest to them as a revelation. But that revelation for me, I think, is the discovery of God in creation.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, Torah for me is a kind of guide. Revelation is a kind of guide to how you see divinity in creation. That for me is the connection between the Asara Ma'amarot and the Aseret Dibrot. The Dibrot sort of help you unpack the Ma'amarot, the presence that's there.
Right.
The God mindfulness of the individual is so co-joined to the occasions of life that his God-human moment is interrelational in the most profound theological sense. Very beautiful. God's voice perceived through the events of the world is, take it without the parentheses, God's voice perceived through the events of the world is responded to with the God-oriented focus that transfigures experienced reality. To know God in all one's ways makes the self an active participant in God's worldly ways. One knows God by being cognitively attuned to the world. I think that's wonderful, but then both the sentence about the duties of Jewish tradition and the parentheses about the traditional mitzvot felt as almost superfluous additions to that, trying to take this essentially universalist about life theology and impose Judaism on it. You know what I'm saying? That felt a little external to it.
So maybe we should have this conversation. What I need to do, and Mona's actually strangely been pushing me in this direction, which I actually had tried to do earlier in Sacred Attunement, my wife Mona. Okay.
Good for you.
One of the ways that I understand the mitzvot, and I try to express in Sacred Atonement, I have to bring back here, is that it's a form of focusing. And I'm trying to kind of answer Art's issue in my own way, where we're both struggling with the interrelation between heteronomy and autonomy, and is this only a natural theology, and then is this a second order thing? Well, it is and it isn't, because I think part of the whole project that I'm trying to express is that the mitzvot are real precisely because we know them through our natural experience. In other words,
If we were brought up with them, you mean?
Yes. Well, I guess the goal of a theology is to help some people who want to enter the Jewish game by seeing that. I mean, I think that's part of the task of theology. A Jewish theology would be not just to limit it to a natural consciousness, which wouldn't be Jewish, but to see how the Jewish form of mitzvot is actually giving expression to that. And that's why I also use the Torah Kalula, because at certain points the mitzvot go their own distorted way, or they get frozen. So the Torah Kalula, which is part of that natural consciousness, pushes you back to a kind of a refocusing. So
Say more what you mean by Torah Kalula, just to spell it out a little bit more.
So the way I articulate it here and there in the book, but much more fully in Sacred Atonement, I think I have to bring it back in here, is that that first order, once you're thinking theologically, not just naturally, we say that this world of St. Francis, the world of the book of nature and the book of life, the book of everything interposed that we have, that comes to us out of the fullness of God's hieroglyph. It's like we don't know how to read it. Like there's just this fullness of holy possibilities, and then we sort of make hermeneutical or exegetical interventions, right? We're trying to kind of make it livable, sacred, holy. But that's the first voice. That first voice, which is, everything. Akol bevat achat, that text that I gave you from the Tanhuma, everything is all at once, but you can't hear everything all at once. You have to try to begin to sort it out. And that becomes, that's the Torah klula, and it's always, at all times, happening. The way I read the Torah Shebechtav with Moshe is that Moshe, out of his own spiritual growth, and he becomes a model for a lot of us, out of his own growth and out of what he's received from tradition, he intuits what is necessary for a particular time. And he brings this into a certain formulation, right? But it's continuing. So Torah Sheba'al Peh has to also work with the world that's making a claim back against the Torah Shebechtav. In other words, the Torah Sheba'al Peh is drawing on the Torah Shebeklula, and it's saying that there are other aspects of life that are not being dealt with, or it's critiquing those aspects of life, or it's saying it has to be wider or more narrow to protect life or to open life up, and so on and so forth. And so there's a series of layers that are going on. For me, to live within the Jewish community is to try to understand how spiritual masters, beginning with Moshe, are trying to give a spiritual shape to that natural divine order and give it a life formulation. And then the ongoing encounter with the Torah Kula, which is the Torah Sheba'al Peh, is constantly trying to modify it and to deal with it in a living way. And that's an ongoing process. So
What happened to Torah Shebechtav?
the Torah
You
Shebechtav,
have Torah Kalula and then Torah
well, the Torah
Sheba'al
Shebechtav
Peh.
is that first moment of what Moshe Rabbeinu and all for whom that name speaks, is that first formulation. And what it's really saying to us is that is ground zero. That's a primary point, but it's not the final point. That's the point that's canonized in the formulation of Scripture. But the original was a voice, so we're trying to get back to the living voice. And that living voice doesn't change the Torah Shebechtav. What it does is it opens up and it modifies it in a living vocal manner, because that becomes that first order of tension. So in a certain sense, and I'd like to hear how you respond to this. I've come to believe that one aspect of Jewish faith is that I have faith that the Torah, of Jewish faith, is that I have faith that the Torah Sheba'al Peh, lo evosh, v'lo ekalem, that it won't lead me to embarrassment and distortion of what it means to live a God-centered life. And so it has to constantly be pushed back against the Torah Shebechtav, which is the fundamental starting point. Sinai is the fundamental starting point. But if I have to have a